She was a ghost in the shadows of the high spire, a flicker of movement where only silence should exist. The cleansing night was a holy ritual, a display of absolute dominance where the elite of the bloodkin renewed their strength. Alara, a mere scavenger from the rusted belly of the lower district, had no place here. But as she crouched behind the velvet curtains of the great hall, her fingers calloused from grease and metal, she saw him. Julian Thorne, the Lord High Executioner. He stood at the center of the dais, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the crimson-stained glass windows. He was too tall to still, like a blade resting before the strike. They said his eyes could see the rhythmic pulse of a human heart through solid stone. They said he had never let a lie go unpunished. The ritual began. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic ang of ancient wine and something far more potent. Julian moved among the kneeling supplicates, his grace predatory and cold. He was looking for a sign, a spark of the primal source that would sustain the city's power for another year. Then he stopped. It wasn't a slow hesitation. It was a violent, jarring halt. His shoulders went rigid, his head tilting back as he drew in a sharp, jagged breath. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that seemed loud enough to shatter the crystal chandeliers. He can't hear me, she told herself, clutching the stolen power cell to her chest. I'm a shadow. I'm nobody. But Julian didn't look at the kneeling nobles. He turned his head slowly with a terrifying precision toward the heavy velvet curtains. His eyes, usually a cold, icy blue, had ignited into a fierce, burning amber. He didn't call the guards. He didn't say a word. He simply began to walk. Each step was a death knell on the marble floor. Alara turned and bolted. She didn't plan. She didn't think. She threw herself through the service exit, her lungs burning with the sudden intake of cold, mountain air. Behind her, the hall erupted. Not into voices, but into a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. "Why are you running, little thief?" The voice didn't come from behind her. It seemed to vibrate from the very air around her, deep and smooth like aged whiskey, carrying a command that made her knees want to buckle. She reached the edge of the spire, the city lights below looking like a sea of fallen stars. She had to choices: jump or face the man who was currently tearing the laws of his own kingdom apart to find her. "You have something that belongs to me," the voice whispered, closer now. She could feel the heat of him. Not the warmth of a human, but the searing, radioactive heat of a predator who had finally found his prey. She turned, her back to the precipice. Julian stood 5 paces away. He had discarded his ceremonial cloak. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, his skin glistening with the sweat of the interrupted ritual. "I have nothing," Ilara spat, her voice trembling but sharp. "I'm a servant. I nobody from the rust." Julian took a step closer. The amber glow in his eyes intensified, a golden fire that seemed to strip her bare. "The scent on your skin," he murmured, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "It's not rust. It's not grease." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her throat. "It's the blood of the sun, a lineage that was extinguished 1,000 years ago." He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. Why is a nameless scavenger carrying the throne's greatest threat in her veins? Alara felt her pulse sleep under his gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Liar," he whispered. Suddenly his hand closed around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The contact was like an electric shock, a violent collision of 2 worlds that should never have met. Alara gasped, her hands instinctively landing on his chest. Through the thin silk of his shirt, she felt his heart. It was racing, matching her own frantic tempo. "Do you feel that?" Julian asked, his hand tightening. "The bond doesn't care about your district. It doesn't care about my crown." "Let me go," she breathed, even as her fingers curled into his shirt. "Never," he replied. "You ran from the ritual, Alara, but you cannot run from the blood." Below them, the sirens of the High Guard began to wail. The hunt was no longer private. The entire city was waking up to the scent of treason. The private chambers of the High Executioner were not what Alara expected. There were no chains, no blood-stained stone walls, no echoes of screams. Instead, there was the suffocating scent of sandalwood and old books, the floor covered in thick, dark carpets that swallowed the sound of her frantic breathing. Julian leaned against the heavy oak door he had just locked, his silhouetted Arcoman against the flickering candlelight. "This is a mistake," Alara whispered, backing away until the backs of her knees hit the edge of a massive, silk-covered bed. "The High Guard saw you take me. They'll expect an execution by dawn. They expect what I tell them to expect," Julian said. He moved into the light, and for the first time Alara saw the true cost of the interrupted ritual. His face was pale, his jaw set in a line of permanent tension. In their eyes, "You are a common thief I've taken for." Personal interrogation. Interrogation? Alara let out a sharp, jag laugh. "Is that what you call kidnapping a girl from the lower district?" "I saved your life," he countered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and silent, like a shadow creeping across the room. "The moment that scent hit the air in the hall, you were dead. The council doesn't investigate the blood of the sun, Alara. They incinerate it." He stopped just inches from her. The heat radiating from his body was an assault on her senses. She could feel her pulse jumping in her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. "Why?" she demanded, tilting her face up to meet his burning amber gaze. "Why risk your position for a nobody?" Julian's eyes darkened, a flash of something ancient and hungry swirling in the gold. He reached out, his long fingers trailing down the side of her face, barely touching her skin, yet leaving a trail of fire in their wake. "Because the wolf doesn't care about politics," he murmured, his voice a rough caress. "And my blood recognized yours before I could even see your face. It's a primal scream, Alara. Aid a man that refuses to be ignored." She slapped his hand away, her eyes flashing with a defiance that made him pause. "I am not a demand. I am not a ritual component. I am a person who was doing fine until you decided to turn my life into a hunt." "Doing fine?" Julian's lip curled into a cold, mocking smile. "Scavenging for scraps in the rust, hiding a mark on your spine that glows every time the moon is full. You were a ticking bomb, little rebel. I just happened to be the one standing there when the fuse ran out." He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her toward a tall, ornate mirror. "Look," he commanded. In the reflection she saw them. The contrast was a physical ache. Julian, the peak of blood-kin perfection, structured, powerful, radiating a terrifying authority. And Alara, covered in the soot of the lower district, her dress torn, her hair a wild mess. But beneath the grime, there was a glow. A faint, golden luminescence shimmering just under her skin, reacting to his proximity. "It's getting stronger," Julian whispered, his hand sliding from her arm to her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "The longer you stay near me, the more your dormant blood wakes up. You can't hide it anymore." Alara stared at the girl in the mirror. She looked like a stranger. "What are you going to do with me?" Julian leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. "I'm going to keep you. I'm going to hide you in plain sight. You will be my personal servant, my shadow. You will eat at my table and sleep behind my doors. And if I refuse, then I open that door," Julian said, his voice turning into ice. "And I let the council take you. I let them put you on the pyre and watch as the last of the sun blood turns to ash. Is that the freedom you want?" Alara felt the weight of the gilded cage closing in. The walls of the room seemed to shrink, the scent of sandalwood becoming a trap. She looked at his reflection, the predator who had claimed her. "You're a monster," she breathed. "I am an executioner," he corrected, his hand sliding up to her jaw, forcing her to look him in the eye through the glass. "And right now, I am the only monster standing between you and the end of the world." He let go of her suddenly, the absence of his heat feeling like a physical blow. "There are clothes in the wardrobe," he said, walking toward the window that overlooked the sleeping city. "Wash the grease from your skin. The High Guard will be here in an hour for the morning report. If you look like a scavenger, you die. If you look like my prize, you live." He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew he had one. Ilara stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling. She looked at the heavy silk of the bed, then at the locked door. She was no longer a ghost in the shadows. She was a bird in a golden cage, and the man holding the key was the very person she had been born to hate. But as she walked toward the bath, she felt the pulse again, the second heartbeat, the thread of fire connecting her to him. It wasn't just fear. It was a terrifying, addictive pull. "I will find a way out," she promised herself, her eyes hardening. "I will burn this cage to the ground." But in the reflection of the dark window, Julian saw her. He saw the fire in her eyes, and for the first time in a century, the Lord High Executioner felt a shiver of true, unadulterated fear. Because he didn't just want her blood. He wanted the soul that was currently vowing to destroy him. The dress was a masterpiece of cruelty. It was the color of a dying star, deep, midnight violet silk that clung to Ilara's skin like a second layer of defense she hadn't asked for. It exposed her shoulders and the delicate line of her throat, leaving her feeling stripped bare despite the heavy fabric. Julian stood behind her in the dressing room, his reflection cold and sharp. He reached forward, his fingers brushing the stray curls away from her neck to fasten a collar of black diamonds. "Don't touch me," Ilara hissed, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. "If you want to survive the next 3 hours, you will let me touch you," Julian replied, his voice a low, vibrating warning. He tightened the clasp. "The council members aren't just looking for a thief, Ilara. They are looking for a reason to tear me down. If they suspect you are anything more than a toy I found in the gutter, we both burn." "A toy," she spat the word like it was ash. "Is that all I am to you?" Julian turned her around, his hands gripping her shoulders with a sudden, jarring intensity. His amber eyes searched hers, searching for the fire he knew was buried there. "Tonight, you are whatever keeps the blade from your throat," he whispered. "Do not speak. Do not look them in the eye. Look only at me. Do you understand?" "I hate you," she whispered back. "Good," Julian said, his thumb brushing against her lower lip for a fleeting, maddening second. "Hate keeps you sharp. Fear only makes you clumsy." The great hall of the spire was a sea of predatory elegance. The bloodkin moved with a slow, languid grace, their skin pale under the glow of 1,000 floating candles. As Julian entered with Ilara on his arm, the room went silent. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of a pack of wolves scenting a stranger in their midst. "Julian, darling, you're late." A woman stepped out from the crowd. Lady Serafina. She was draped in silver, her hair white as bone, her eyes a piercing, unnatural violet. She looked at Ilara, and the air between them turned to ice. "And who is this charming little creature?" Serafina asked. Her voice like silk wrapped around a razor. She stepped closer, her nose twitching slightly. "She smells of the lower district. Of grease and something else." "She is mine," Julian said, his voice cutting through the tension like a guillotine. He pulled Ilara closer to his side, his hand resting possessively on her waist. "That is all you need to know, Serafina." "Is it?" Serafina circled them, her eyes narrowed. "The council is whispering, Julian. They say you interrupted the sacred ritual for a ghost. They say the High Executioner has lost his mind over a scavenger." She stopped in front of Ilara and reached out a gloved hand, lifting Ilara's chin. Ilara forced herself not to flinch, remembering Julian's warning. "She has pretty eyes," Serafina murmured, "but they look far too intelligent for a blood slave. Tell me, girl, do you know the penalty for trespassing in the High Spire?" Ilara felt the golden pulse in her blood begin to throb. It was a warning. Julian's grip on her waist tightened, his muscles coiling like a spring. "She doesn't speak your language, Serafina," Julian lied smoothly. "She's a mute I found near the border." "How convenient," Serafina laughed, but the sound was hollow. She suddenly pulled a small, silver dagger from her belt, the blade of truth. Then she won't mind a small test. They say this metal only burns those with a lie in their veins. Before Julian could move, Serafina flicked the blade toward Alara's exposed shoulder. The world slowed. Alara felt the heat before the metal touched her. But it wasn't the blade that was hot, it was her own blood. Just as the tip was about to break her skin, Julian's hand shot out. He caught the blade with his bare palm, the silver searing into his flesh. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Blood, dark, rich, and ancient, dripped from Julian's hand onto the white marble floor. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply stared down at Serafina with an expression of such cold, absolute fury that the woman stepped back, her face turning ashen. "You will never," Julian whispered, his voice vibrating with the power of an unleashed alpha, "touch what belongs to me again." "Julian, she's just a servant," Serafina stammered. "She is my mate," Julian roared, the words shaking the very foundations of the hall. The silence that followed was deafening. The council members stared. Serafina trembled. And Alara felt the thread between her and Julian snap into a blinding, terrifying reality. He had said it. He had declared it before the entire world. Julian didn't wait for a response. He grabbed Alara's hand and pulled her out of the hall toward the high balcony overlooking the precipice. The cold night air hit them, but Alara was burning. As soon as they were alone, she spun on him, her eyes wide with panic and rage. "What did you do?" she screamed. "You just signed my death warrant," you told them all. Julian was leaning against the stone railing, wrapping a silk handkerchief around his bleeding hand. He looked at her, his amber eyes fading back to blue, but the intensity remained. "I did what I had to do to stop her from cutting you," he said. "The moment that blade touched you, your blood would have reacted. The whole room would have seen the golden glow. I gave them a scandal to distract them from a revolution. You called me your mate," Alara whispered, her voice trembling. "In front of everyone." Julian walked toward her, his shadow looming large in the moonlight. He stopped so close she could feel the frantic beat of his heart through his vest. "I didn't say it for them, Alara," he said, his voice dropping to a rough, broken murmur. He reached out his uninjured hand and cupped the back of her neck, pulling her toward him. "I've spent 100 years looking for a reason to breathe," Julian whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "And then I smelled you in that forest. I felt the sun in your veins. You think I'm a monster for keeping you here? Maybe I am. But I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let them take you. I can't be what you want," Alara sobbed, her hands clutching his lapels. "I'm a rebel. I'm a traitor to your kind. Then we will be traitors together," Julian breathed. He tilted her face up, his eyes searching hers for a long, agonizing moment. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the taste of iron and silk, of forbidden magic and desperate hope. Alara felt her world shattering. Every wall she had built, every bit of hate she had nurtured in the lower district, melted away under the searing heat of his mouth. She wasn't a bird in a cage anymore. She was a storm meeting a mountain. When they finally pulled apart, Alara was breathless, her lips swollen, her heart racing in a rhythm she no longer recognized as her own. She looked up at the High Executioner, the man who was supposed to be her enemy, and saw the truth. The hunt hadn't ended. It had just changed. "They're coming for us now, aren't they?" she asked, looking back toward the lights of the Great Hall. Julian looked at his bleeding hand, then at her. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, the look of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. "Let them come," he said. "I've been waiting for a war." The warning didn't come from the bells or the guards. It came from the air. Julian felt the temperature in the bedroom drop 10 degrees in a single second. The shadows in the corners of the room didn't just flicker, they detached themselves from the walls, stretching toward the bed like ink dropped into water. Shadow wraiths. The council's silent executioners. "Get up," Julian hissed, lunging across the room. He didn't wait for Alara to wake fully. He grabbed her from the silk sheets, his hand covering her mouth as he pulled her into the secret stone passage behind the wardrobe. "What is Elara?" started, her voice muffled against his palm. "They chose war sooner than I expected," Julian whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness. The declaration at the banquet was a catalyst. "We are no longer safe in the spire." They burst out of the lower tunnels into the freezing rain of the mountain pass. Julian's warhorse, a massive beast with eyes like burning embers, was already waiting. He swung Elara onto the saddle and vaulted up behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his arms caging her in as he gripped the reins. "Hold on," he commanded. The ride was a blur of thunder and adrenaline. Behind them, the high spire glowed with a sickly violet light. The council's mages were scanning the mountains. They were being hunted. Not as a thief and a lord, but as two parts of a prophecy the city wanted to bury. By the time they reached the border of the Outlands, the sky had turned a bruised orange. The air here was thin, poisoned by the remnants of the Great Collapse. "Julian," Elara gasped, her grip on his forearms weakening. I can't breathe." Julian pulled the horse to a halt beneath a jagged overhang of red rock. As he lifted Elara down, he realized she wasn't just tired. Her skin was searingly hot, glowing with a faint, rhythmic amber light that pulsed in time with her heart. "The sunblood," Julian muttered, his face tight with worry. "The transition to the Outlands. The raw atmosphere is triggering the awakening." He carried her deep into a shallow cave, laying her on his discarded leather cloak. Elara groaned, her eyes rolling back. The golden light under her skin was becoming violent now, shimmering like liquid fire. "It hurts," she choked out, her fingers clawing at the dirt. "It's burning me from the inside." Julian knelt beside her, his own blood singing in response. He was a creature of the moon, of shadows and ice. She was the sun. They were cosmic opposites, and the proximity was turning her awakening into a catastrophe. "Look at me, Elara," he commanded, grabbing her hands. "You have to anchor yourself." "Use me. I'll burn you," she sobbed, a spark of pure golden light flickering from her fingertips, scorching the stone floor. "Then let me burn," Julian growled. He didn't pull away. Instead, he pulled her into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around her trembling frame. He pressed his cold skin against her burning neck, offering his own vampiric chill to balance her solar fire. The collision of energies was agonizing. Julian felt his own skin blistering, his ancient blood boiling under the intensity of her power. But he didn't let go. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, his voice a low, steady chant. "I am the shadow that holds the light. I am the earth that contains the storm. Give it to me, Elara. Share the weight." Elara let out a primal scream that echoed through the canyons. A shockwave of golden energy erupted from her body, shattering the stalactites above them and turning the darkness of the cave into high noon. Julian held her through it all. He absorbed the brunt of the blast, his clothes charring, his body trembling with the effort of not being vaporized. Slowly, the light began to recede. The violent pulsing under Elara's skin softened into a steady, warm glow. Her breathing slowed, and she collapsed against his chest, her hair fanned out like golden silk against his dark tunic. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian sat there in the cooling cave, his arms still locked around her. He was exhausted, his body covered in minor burns, but he didn't care. He looked down at the woman in his arms, the scavenger, the rebel, the sun-born queen, and felt a terrifying sense of peace. Elara opened her eyes. They weren't brown anymore. They were flecked with gold, swirling with a power that made the air hum. She looked at Julian's face, at the soot on his jaw, the burns on his hands, and the unwavering devotion in his blue eyes. "You stayed," she whispered, her hand rising to touch his cheek. "Even when I was destroying everything. You didn't leave." "I told you," Julian said, his voice a rough, tired rasp. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her forehead. "You are everything to me. A little fire isn't going to change that." Elara pulled back slightly, looking at her own glowing hands. "What am I, Julian, truly?" "You are the end of the old world," Julian said, his eyes darkening with a mixture of pride and fear, "and the beginning of whatever comes next." He stood up, lifting her with him as if she weighed nothing. Outside the cave, the Outlands stretched out, a wasteland of monsters and ruins. But for the first time in her life, Alara didn't feel like a victim. She looked at the man beside her, the tyrant who had become her protector, the monster who had become her mate. "They'll follow us here," she said, her voice steady. "I hope they do," Julian replied, his hand finding hers and interlacing their fingers. "Because now, my queen has teeth." He led her out into the orange sunlight, to shadows walking through a broken world, bound by a blood bond that not even the gods could break. The war had only just begun, but as Alara felt the heat of Julian's hand in hers, she knew one thing for certain. The high spire was going to fall, and they would be the ones to light the match. The sky didn't just darken, it bruised. A cinder storm was sweeping across the jagged horizon of the Outlands, a swirling vortex of radioactive ash and static electricity that could strip the flesh from a man's bones in minutes. There, Julian shouted over the rising howl of the wind, pointing toward a rusted iron bulkhead half buried in a sand dune. "A pre-collapse bunker. Move." He didn't wait for Alara to respond, grabbing her waist and shielding her body with his own as the first grains of scorching ash began to pelt them. They dove through the hatch just as the storm hit, the heavy iron door clanging shut with a finality that echoed like a casket closing. The darkness inside was absolute until Alara's skin began to glow. The soft, amber radiance emanating from her veins illuminated a space filled with the smell of wet earth and cold metal. But they weren't alone. "Don't move, Bloodkin." The click of a dozen magnetic rifles echoed through the chamber. From the shadows, figures emerged, men and women dressed in tactical rags, their faces covered by breathers. At their center stood a man with a scarred face and eyes that held the coldness of the desert night. "Kaelin." Well, Kaelin whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The Lord High Executioner himself, crawling into the dirt like a rat. I never thought I'd see the day." Julian pushed Alara behind him, his hand going to the hilt of his sword, his blue eyes turning into icy slits. "Kaelin, I should have guessed you'd be leading the scavengers out here." "Scavengers?" Kaelin stepped forward, the barrel of his rifle leveled at Julian's heart. "We are the people you broke, Julian. The ones you deemed imperfect and cast out of your precious spire. And now, you bring a toy with you to our doorstep." "She is not a toy," Julian growled, a sound so primal it made the armed rebels take a half step back. "She is the only reason I haven't killed you all for pointing those toys at us." "Wait." Alara stepped out from behind Julian's shadow. The golden light in her eyes was swirling, intense, catching the reflection in the rebels' goggles. "We aren't here for the council. We're fleeing them." Kaelin's eyes locked onto her skin. He lowered his rifle slightly, a look of profound shock crossing his face. "The Sunblood. It's impossible. They burned the last of your line 17 years ago in the Sector 7 purge." "Sector 7? Alara's heart skipped. "My parents lived in Sector 7. They told me it was an industrial accident. A gas leak." Kaelin let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Is that what the Spire told you? There was no leak. Girl, the council detected a solar signature in a child you. They sent the executioners to erase the entire block." He looked pointedly at Julian. "Ask him." He was the commander of the High Guard back then. The silence that followed was more suffocating than the ash storm outside. Alara turned slowly to look at Julian. Her hand, which had been resting on his arm, began to tremble. "Julian," she whispered. "Tell me HES lying." Julian's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with an agonizing fracture. "I wasn't the one who gave the order, Alara, but I was the one who led the sweep. I didn't know about the child. I was told it was a nest of insurgents." Alara backed away, her hands bursting into a blinding golden flame that scorched the air. "You lead them? You were at the place where my mother died." "Alara, listen to me." Julian took a step toward her, his hands held open, pleading. "Stay back," she screamed. A wave of heat erupted from her, forcing Julian and the rebels to shield their eyes. All this time, You were the monster for my nightmares. You didn't find me at the banquet, Julian. You've been haunting my life since I was 8 years old. I am a different man now, Julian roared over the hum of her power, his voice thick with a desperate, raw honesty. I broke my vows for you, I declared war on my own kind for you. Kaelin saw his moment. Hes a blood kin, girl. He'll always be a tool of the Spire. Give him to us, and you can lead this resistance. With your power, we can actually win. Julian didn't look at Kaelin. He didn't look at the rifles. He kept his eyes fixed on Alara, even as the heat from her skin began to singe his tunic. Slowly, he reached for his belt. He unclipped the silver and ruby seal of the Lord High Executioner, the object that granted him absolute power over life and death. He dropped it in the dirt at Alara's feet. My life ended the moment I saw you in that clearing, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. If you want my head for what happened 17 years ago, take it. I won't fight you. I am yours, Alara. Not the Council's. Not the Spire's. Just yours, and thus yours. Alara looked from the discarded seal to the man kneeling before her. The fire in her hands flickered, then died down to a low ember. The rage was still there, a cold weight in her chest, but beneath it was the bond, the thrumming, insistent heartbeat that told her he was telling the truth. She looked at Kaelin, her eyes cold and sharp as diamonds. He stays with me, she commanded. It wasn't a request, it was the voice of a queen. If any of you touch him, I will turn this bunker into a furnace. He is my mate, and his sins are mine to judge, not yours. Kaelin hesitated, then signaled his men to lower their weapons. Fine, but he sleeps in the holding pen. And you, we need to talk about what you can really do with that light. That night, in the dim glow of the bunker's emergency lights, Julian sat behind bars in a rusted cage. Alara stood outside, her fingers gripping the cold iron. I still hate what you were, she whispered into the dark. Julian reached through the bars, his hand covering hers. He didn't try to pull her closer, he just held her there, a silent anchor in the storm. I hate him too, Julian replied. But the man I am now. He would die 1,000 deaths just to see you smile once. Alara leaned her forehead against the bars, a single tear tracing a path through the soot on her cheek. The hunt was over, the secrets were out, and the real war was finally beginning. Kaelin says there are more, she said. More people like me. Hiding in the shadows. Then we find them, Julian said, his blue eyes reflecting her golden glow. We find them, we arm them, and we take back the sun. The blood bond pulsed stronger, darker, and more resilient than ever. They were no longer a lord and a servant. They were the architects of a revolution. The training grounds were nothing more than a hollowed-out cathedral of rusted steel and cracked concrete. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, rhythmic thud of metal hitting metal. Again, Julian commanded. His voice was a whip cracking through the silence of the bunker. He stood stripped to the waist, his pale skin crisscrossed with the silver scars of 100 years of service to a city that had eventually betrayed him. In his hand was a training blade, in his eyes was a cold, relentless focus. Alara lunged. Her movement was fast, fueled by the solar fire humming in her veins, but Julian was a blur. He stepped into her guard, his forearm slamming into hers, and with a flick of his wrist, he pinned her against a rusted pillar. You're relying on the light, Julian hissed, his chest heaving against hers. Their sweat mingled in the humid air of the underground. The light is a gift, Alara, but your body is the weapon. If your fire fails, you die. My fire doesn't fail, Alara shot back, her breath hitching as she felt the cool hardness of his skin pressing into her heat. The proximity was a drug, a chaotic swirl of the bond's pull and the memory of the blood he had once spilled. Then control it, Julian growled. He leaned in closer, his lips inches from her ear. Don't let it explode. Channel it. Focus the sun into a needle, not a bonfire. He let her go, but the ghost of his touch lingered like a burn. Alara closed her eyes, drawing from the core of her heat. She didn't let the light wash over her skin this time. She forced it down into the palm of her hand, until a small, vibrating sphere of pure white brilliance formed. It was so intense it hummed a low, terrifying note. Julian's eyes widened. A slow, predatory pride curved his lips. Better. But the moment of triumph was shattered by a mechanical roar from above. The bunker shook, dust raining down from the ceiling. The perimeter is breached. K.A. Elan's voice echoed through the intercom, followed by the terrifying shriek of tearing metal. It's vain that the Black Plate Cavalry is here. Julian's face went white. Commander Vane was a butcher, a man Julian had trained himself, known for leaving nothing but ash in his wake. They tracked the seal, Julian muttered, his eyes darting to the dirt where he had dropped his badge days ago. Vane doesn't just want the girl. He wants my head on a pike for the council. He's not getting either, Alara said, her voice dropping into a register of cold certainty that made even Julian pause. The sphere of light in her hand didn't flicker, it grew sharper. They burst into the main hangar to find chaos. The black armored soldiers were pouring through the breached hatch, their mag rifles spitting violet bolts of energy. KALN's rebels were being driven back, their crude weapons no match for the Spire's elite. Vane stood at the center of the carnage, his black visor reflecting the fires. Julian, he bellowed. Step forward and die like a lord, or stay hidden and die like a dog with your scavenger queen. Julian stepped out into the light of the fires, his sword drawn. Vane, you always did talk too much. The clash was a collision of titans. Julian moved like a whirlwind of silver and shadow, parrying Vane's heavy strikes with a grace that defied his exhaustion. But he was one man against a legion. A violet bolt caught Julian in the shoulder, spinning him around. Vane leveled his heavy cannon at Julian's chest. No, Alara screamed. She didn't run to him. She didn't plead. She planted her feet and opened her soul. The light didn't just glow, it detonated. But it wasn't a chaotic blast. Remembering Julian's words, she channeled the fury of her ancestors into a focused lattice of solar spears. They arched over the rebels and slammed into the black armored ranks with the precision of a surgical strike. Vane fired. Julian, seeing the projectile, threw himself in front of Alara. The heavy slug slammed into his side, knocking the air from his lungs, but he didn't fall. He stayed upright, a wall of bone and sheer will protecting the source of the light. Alara's eyes went completely white. Get away from him. A pillar of pure solar radiation erupted from her, a localized sun that vaporized the air itself. The Black Plate soldiers were thrown back like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Vane was lifted off his feet, his armor melting, his screams silenced by the roar of the awakening. When the light faded, the hangar was silent. The invaders were gone, scattered or destroyed. Alara collapsed to her knees, her skin smoking, her energy spent. Julian crawled toward her, his side trailing dark blood, his face a mask of agony and awe. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her golden hair. You did it, he whispered, coughing up blood. You focused it. Julian, you're bleeding, she sobbed, clutching at the wound in his side. Why did you do that? You could have moved. Julian let out a weak, jagged laugh, leaning his head against her shoulder. The bond was pulsing like a drum, a frantic, beautiful connection of two souls who had finally found their purpose. The shadow always protects the sun, he murmured, his eyes beginning to flutter shut. It's the only law that matters. Kaylin and the surviving rebels gathered around them, their weapons lowered in reverence. They didn't see a lord and a servant anymore. They saw a miracle. Alara looked up at the hole in the ceiling, at the bruised sky of the Outlands. She felt the power humming in her blood, stronger than ever, and she felt Julian's life force flickering like a candle in the wind. She pressed her glowing hand against his wound, her eyes turning back to gold. You aren't dying today, Julian Thorne, she whispered. We have a city to burn. As her light began to knit his flesh back together, the rebels let out a cheer that shook the mountain. The girl from the rest was gone. The Sun Queen had arrived, and she had an executioner at her right hand. The air in the underground med bay was heavy with the scent of burned ozone and Julian's cooling blood. He lay on the metal table, his eyes fixed on Alara as her hands moved over the jagged wound in his side. The golden light flowing from her fingertips was no longer a violent eruption, it was a rhythmic, soothing pulse. She was knitting him back together, cell by cell, her brow furrowed in a concentration so fierce it looked like prayer. "You're pushing too hard," Julian rasped, his hand catching her wrist. "You'll drain yourself before the march begins." "I won't lose you," Alara replied, her voice a low iron last vow. She looked at him, her eyes flecked with brilliant amber. "Not after everything. Not when we're finally standing at the edge of the end." Julian pulled her hand to his lips, kissing the glowing palm. "There's one thing I haven't told you, Alara. One final weight I've carried since the night I took you from the banquet." Alara went still. "More secrets, Julian." "The High Spire isn't just a fortress," Julian began, sitting up slowly as the last of the wound sealed into a thin silver scar. "It's a machine. The Aegis system that keeps the sun locked away and the shadows in power. It has a failsafe, a physical lock deep beneath the foundation." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a jagged, obsidian shard, a relic of the first executioners. 100 years ago, when the city was built, the founders knew that absolute power would eventually lead to madness. They created a key, but it was designed to be a suicide pact. It requires the neural signature of a Lord High Executioner and the living blood of a Sun Queen to activate. One cannot turn it without the other. It was meant to ensure that if the world were to be changed, it would have to be by a choice made in unison. Alara looked at the obsidian shard, then at Julian. "You've had this all along?" "I am the last of the lineage with the clearance," Julian whispered. "But until you walked into that clearing, the key was just a dead piece of rock. Now it's the only way to drop the Spire's shields without killing everyone inside the city." "So we go in," Alara said, her hand finding his. Together. The march on the High Spire began under a sky choked with ash. Kael'en's rebels surged through the industrial sectors, a tide of rusted metal and desperate hope. Alara stood at the vanguard, a beacon of pure light that cut through the smog like a lighthouse. They didn't strike the gates. Julian led them through the Sewer of Kings, a forgotten labyrinth of stone and bone that led directly into the heart of the machine. As they reached the great vault, the air began to hum with a terrifying frequency. This was the source of the violet darkness that held the world in its grip. "Julian Thorne." The voice boomed from the shadows. Arch-Chancellor Thorne, Julian's own father, stepped into the light. He looked like an older, colder version of Julian, his eyes devoid of anything resembling humanity. "I suspected you would come to the cellar eventually," the Chancellor said, his gaze landing on Alara with a look of profound disgust. "To think, my own son would bring the torch to his own house." "This isn't a house, Father," Julian said, drawing his sword. The blade caught Alara's light, glowing with a lethal, shimmering heat. "It's a tomb, and it's time to let the dead rest." "You cannot turn the key," the Chancellor mocked. "Even if you kill me, the blood sacrifice required to break the Aegis will vaporize the girl. Do you love her enough to watch her turn to ash, Julian?" Julian hesitated, his grip on the obsidian shard tightening. The air in the vault grew heavy, the violet energy of the Aegis beginning to lash out at Alara, sensing its opposite. Alara stepped forward, her hand reaching for the obsidian shard in Julian's hand. "He doesn't have to decide," she said, her voice echoing with the power of 1,000 suns. She looked at Julian, her eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. "The bond doesn't just make us mates, Julian. It makes us a singular force. My blood won't vaporize, it will ignite. But only if you're strong enough to hold me while it happens." Julian looked at the Chancellor, then at the woman who had redefined his entire existence. He threw the obsidian shard into the central pillar and grabbed Delia's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then we ignite," Julian growled. He sliced his palm with his blade and pressed his bleeding hand against the obsidian, while Alara pressed her glowing fingers against the other side. The vault exploded into a blinding conflict of violet and gold. The Chancellor screamed as the backlash of his own machine tore through him. Julian felt his veins screaming, the raw solar energy of Alara's blood rushing into his shadow-born heart. It was an agony beyond description. His skin was burning, his bones felt like they were turning to glass. But he didn't let go. He pulled Alara flush against him, his arms a cage of iron, his spirit acting as the lightning rod for the storm she was releasing. "Hold on," he roared over the sound of the world breaking. "I have you," she screamed back. Through the pain, they felt it the snap. The aegis shattered. The violet veil that had covered the city for a century evaporated in a single, silent heartbeat. Above them, for the first time in 100 years, the clouds parted. Real sunlight, pure and filtered, and ancient, poured down into the streets of the high spire. The machine died. The vault went silent. Julian collapsed to the floor, his clothes smoking, his body covered in golden fractals of light that refused to fade. Alara fell with him, her skin cooling, her breathing shallow but steady. They lay there in the ruins of the spire's heart, the darkness finally gone. "Julian," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Julian opened his eyes. They weren't blue anymore. They were a shimmering, iridescent violet gold, the eyes of a creature that was no longer just bloodkin but something entirely new. He looked up at the shaft of sunlight piercing through the rubble. "It's morning," he whispered. He pulled her into his arms, his chest heaving with the weight of the victory. They had won the war, but the world they had made was a stranger to them both. Outside, the cheers of the rebels rose like a storm. But inside the vault, there was only the sound of two hearts beating in a single, perfect rhythm. The Sun Queen and her executioner. The shadow that had learned to love the light. The sun was a stranger that would not leave. For 7 days, the sky over the spire had been a brilliant, unyielding blue, but the light didn't bring peace. It brought clarity to the wreckage. In the streets below, the lower district was rising. The air filled with the sound of hammers breaking stone and the intermittent cracks of mag rifles as old scores were settled in the alleys. Alara stood on the balcony of the High Chancellor's former office, her hand gripping the cold marble railing until her knuckles turned white. She wore a simple tunic of white linen, but the golden fractals under her skin made her look like a goddess carved from fire. "They want their blood, Alara." Julian's voice came from the shadows of the room. He didn't come into the light. He never did anymore. Since the aegis broke, the sunlight seemed to physically pain him, carving deep lines of exhaustion into his beautiful, cruel face. "They want justice," Alara corrected, turning to look at him. "The council members are being rounded up. The labor camps are open." "They don't just want the council," Julian said, his voice a low, hollow rasp. He stepped forward just enough for the light to hit his boots. Kaelan's lieutenants spent the morning chanting my name in the courtyard. They haven't forgotten who led the sweep 17 years ago. My presence beside you isn't a symbol of peace anymore, Alara. It's a stain on your revolution. I don't care what they chant. Alara crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing the lapels of his dark coat. "You are the only reason I'm alive. The only reason this city is breathing." Julian looked down at her, his iridescent eyes swirling with a mixture of adoration and agony. He reached up, his fingers ghosting over her jaw, but he didn't pull her closer. "I'm leaving, Alara. There's a nest of void stalkers in the sublivis of the spire, creatures the aegis kept at bay that are now waking up in the heat. It'll take a detachment of those still loyal to me. We'll clear the dark zones." "You're exiling yourself," she accused, her voice breaking. "You're running away because you think it will make my crown easier to wear." "It's not an exile if I choose it," Julian whispered. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, agonizing second. "I am a creature of the dark, my queen. I held the light for as long as I could, but the sun, it's blinding me." Before she could scream at him, before she could command him to stay, he vanished into the shadows of the hallway. The next 3 days were a nightmare. Without Julian's presence to anchor her, the solar fire in Alara's veins began to warp. It wasn't a warm glow anymore, it was a fever. Every time she spoke, sparks flew from her lips. The furniture in her room began to smolder just from her touch. She was a star turning into a supernova, and she was alone. The container is missing. A woman stood in the doorway, an old woman with skin like parchment and eyes the color of ash. She was a sojourner, one of the few humans who had survived by studying the ancient lore of the sun blood. "What are you talking about?" Elara gasped, her skin literally smoking as she paced the room. "The sun blood was never meant to exist in a vacuum. Child," the woman said, walking toward her without fear. "Your ancestors didn't rule alone. They were paired with the Shadowkin. The light provides the life, but the shadow provides the form. Without Julian to absorb the excess radiation of your spirit, you will burn until there is nothing left but a crater where this city used to be." Elara stopped. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The bond wasn't just a romantic destiny, it was a biological necessity. She was a weapon that needed a sheath. "Where is he?" Elara demanded. "The deep vaults. Section 9. The abyss." Elara didn't wait for a guard. She didn't take a weapon. She sprinted through the corridors of the spire, descending into the damp, lightless depths where the sun had never reached and never would. The air grew cold, smelling of ancient dust and ozone. She found him in a chamber of jagged obsidian, surrounded by the corpses of 3 void stalkers. Julian was on one knee, his sword snapped in half, his body covered in black ichor. He was trembling. The darkness was reclaiming him, but without the light to balance it, he looked like a ghost fading into the stone. "Julian!" She threw herself at him, her body erupting in a blinding flare of gold. "Elara, they're back." Julian choked out, his eyes wide with terror. I'm unstable. The dark is too heavy down here. Then let me carry it." She slammed her mouth against his, a kiss that was less of a caress and more of a desperate transfusion. She forced the white-hot agony of her power into his lungs, into his heart, into his very soul. Julian let out a broken, guttural sound, his hands clawing at her back as he fought the sudden influx of energy. For a moment, the chamber was filled with a terrifying, violet gold hum as their 2 natures collided and finally, violently, fused. The fever in Elara's blood broke. The darkness in Julian's heart solidified. They fell to the floor together, gasping, their limbs intertwined in the dirt. The silence of the vault returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was a shared breath. "You can't leave me," Elara whispered, her fingers curling into his hair, pulling his face toward hers. "If you go, I burn. If I stay, you fade. We are a curse, Julian. A beautiful, devastating curse." Julian looked at her, his eyes finally steady. He realized then that he could never be the noble sacrifice he wanted to be. He was tethered to her by more than love, he was bound by the very fabric of existence. "I thought I was saving you," Julian murmured, his voice returning to its deep, velvety strength. "You're an idiot," she replied, and for the first time since the war ended, she let out a small, tired laugh. She pulled his head down to the crook of her neck, feeling his cool breath against her heated skin. "The city will have to learn to live with a monster at my side," Elara said, her eyes glowing with a renewed, controlled fire. "Because I'm not ruling without my shadow." In the deep dark of the vault, the Lord High Executioner finally accepted his fate. He reached out, his hand sliding up her thigh, pulling her flush against him with a possessiveness that made her breath hitch. "Then let them tremble," Julian whispered. He didn't care about the rebels. He didn't care about the council. He had the sun in his arms, and for the first time in his life, the executioner wasn't afraid of the morning. The betrayal didn't come with a roar, it came with a whisper. Elara was in the map room, planning the redistribution of the Spire's resources when Kalen entered. He didn't look like a revolutionary anymore. He looked like a man who had tasted a drop of power and found it more addictive than the blood Julian's kind craved. "The people are restless, Elara," Kalen said, his voice smooth and cold. "They see you in the gardens with the executioner. They see the Sun Queen sleeping with the wolf who guarded their cages. It's a bad image. I am not a symbol for your propaganda." "Kalen," Ella replied, not looking up from the scrolls. Julian is the reason the Aegis fell. He is the reason we have a future. No, Kaelin hissed, leaning over the table. He's the reason we have a past we can't forget. And as long as he breathes, the revolution is incomplete. Before Elara could react, Kaelin slammed a heavy black stone onto the table. Void ore. A vacuum of light erupted from the stone. Elara felt the solar fire in her veins scream as it was forcibly sucked toward the obsidian. Her knees hit the floor, her vision blurring as the golden glow under her skin dimmed to a dull, sickly gray. What have you done? She gasped. I've done what was necessary, Kaelin said, looking down at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. The Cinder Legion is at the gates. They don't want the sun, Elara. They want the meat. And I've promised them the Bloodkin in exchange for my seat on the new council. Outside, the city erupted into a symphony of slaughter. The Cinder Legion 10-foot-tall monstrosities of muscle and bone armor were pouring over the walls, led by Kay Raylan's turncoat rebels. Julian was the first target. Elara was dragged, weakened and shackled with void ore chains to the central execution square. There, Julian was pinned to the stone by 6 magnetic pikes, his body broken, his violet gold eyes dimming as Kaelin stood over him with a vibrating execution blade. Look at him, Kaelin shouted to the terrified crowd. The great Lord High Executioner, reduced to a heap of cooling blood. This is what happens when you trust the Spire. Julian looked up, not at Kaelin but at Elara. Even through the haze of agony his lips moved, forming a single word. Elara felt something snap. It wasn't the chains and it wasn't the void ore. It was the last thread of her hesitation. She looked at Julian, at the man who had burned for her, bled for her, and rewritten his soul for her, and she realized that her light wasn't a gift from the sky. It was a response to his shadow. Kaelin, she screamed, the sound echoing with a frequency that cracked the stones of the square. The void ore chains began to vibrate. They didn't just break, they turned to dust. The light returning to Elara wasn't the warm amber of a morning sun. It was the blinding, white-hot fury of a dying star. You think you can cage the sun? Elara stepped forward, each footfall leaving a scorched imprint on the marble. You think you can use my people as currency for monsters? She lunged toward the platform, her hand reaching for Julian. Kaelin swung the blade, but Elara caught the vibrating metal with her bare hand, melting it into liquid slag in a single second. She knelt beside Julian, her glowing fingers finding the pikes. She didn't pull them out, she vaporized them. Julian, she whispered, pulling his head into her lap. Give me your hand. Elara, the backlash will kill you. Julian choked out, his hand trembling as it reached for hers. Let it, she replied. She leaned down and bit her own lip, pressing her bleeding mouth against his. This wasn't a transfusion anymore. It was a merger. The world went white. A pillar of pure, unadulterated energy erupted from the square, piercing the clouds and scattering the Cinder Legion like ash in a gale. In that moment, the bond was perfected. The Sun Queen and the Shadow Lord were no longer two beings. They were an eclipse, a singular, devastating force of nature. Julian stood up, his wounds closing with a sound like snapping ice. His aura was no longer just dark, it was outlined in a lethal, shimmering gold. He looked at Kaelin, who was cowering at the edge of the platform. Julian didn't use a sword. He simply reached out a hand, and the shadows around Kaelin turned into solid, razor-sharp blades. You spoke of justice, Kaelin, Julian said, his voice echoing with the weight of 2 souls. Now meet the executioner. In a blur of motion, the traitor was gone. Elara stood beside Julian, the white fire still dancing in her eyes. The Cinder Legion was in full retreat, their primitive minds unable to process the celestial power they had just witnessed. The city went quiet. The rebels, the citizens, and the remaining bloodkin all fell to their knees. It wasn't the kneeling of subjects to a tyrant. It was the reverence of mortals before a miracle. Elara looked at Julian, at the golden fractals now permanently etched into his skin, and at the hand he held out to her. "The war is over," she said, her voice carrying across the square, "but the world belongs to the ones who were brave enough to burn." Julian pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of victory and blood. The sun was setting, but for the first time in history, the night held no fear. The Sun Queen had her shadow, and the shadow had his soul. The reconstruction of the spire took months, but the healing of the soul took longer. The violet glass of the high hall had been replaced with clear quartz, allowing the unfiltered sun to bathe the throne room in a warmth it had never known. The city below was no longer divided by districts of rust and gold. It was a sprawling, chaotic, living organism, breathing the air of a freedom that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. On the day of the sovereign's rite, Elara stood before the glass, watching the citizens gather in the plaza below. She wore a gown of woven sunlight and obsidian silk, a visual testament to the balance she and Julian had struck. A hand settled on the small of her back. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. The bond hummed between them, a low, contented vibration like a cat purring in the dark. "The people are waiting for their queen," Julian whispered. He was dressed in a simple, high-collared black tunic, the golden fractals on his neck shimmering like a constellation. He had refused a crown. He had refused a seat on the council. He had chosen, instead, to remain the shadow that guarded the light. "I'm not a queen of the old world, Julian," Elara said, turning in his arms. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp, familiar line of his jaw. "I am a scavenger who learned to burn. I don't want a throne. I want a future." "You have both," Julian replied, his iridescent eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "And you have me. Until the sun goes cold and the shadows swallow the earth, you have me." The coronation was not a ceremony of gold and oil. It was a ceremony of breath and blood. Before the assembled representatives of the lower district, the survivors of the blood kin and the outland tribes, Elara took her place at the center of the dais. She didn't sit. She stood. Julian stepped forward, not to crown her, but to offer his hand. Together they cut their palms with a single silver blade and pressed them together, their blood mingling and erupting into a soft, violet gold aura that enveloped the entire hall. "We do not rule over you," Elara's voice rang out, steady and powerful. "We rule for you. The spire is no longer a cage. It is a lighthouse. And let it be known that from this day forward, no one walks in the dark alone." The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a tidal wave of sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain. But amidst the thunder, Elara only heard the quiet, steady beat of Julian's heart. That night they left the celebrations behind. They rode Julian's great warhorse back to the forest where it had all begun, the sacred clearing where the ritual had been interrupted. The silver moon was high, its light mingling with the faint, fairden glow of the horizon. It was the hour of the eclipse. "This is where I first smelled you," Julian murmured, leaning against an ancient oak as Elara walked through the tall grass. "I remember the terror in your eyes, and the fire in your spirit that I couldn't understand. I thought you were going to kill me," Elara said, turning back to him, her skin glowing softly in the twilight. "I thought you were the end of my life." "I was," Julian said, walking toward her, his movements still carrying that predatory grace that once made her tremble. "The man I was died that night. You didn't just find a mate, Elara. You created a soul." He stopped in front of her, his hands finding her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The contact was no longer an assault, it was a homecoming. "I have a gift for you," Julian whispered, his voice dropping to that deep, velvety rasp that always made her knees weak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished wooden ring, carved from the roots of the very tree they stood beneath. It was simple, humble, and held more weight than any diamond in the spire. "No more blood oaths," Julian said, sliding the ring onto her finger. "No more ancient prophecies. Just a promise from a man to his wife. I am yours. In the light and in the shadow. In the hunger and in the feast." Elara looked at the ring, then up at the monster who had become her world. She felt the tears pricking her eyes, not tears of fear, but of an overwhelming, soul-deep peace. "I sentence you to a lifetime of me, Julian Thorne," she whispered, her hands curling into his hair, pulling him down to her. "No parole. No escape." Julian let out a low, husky laugh against her lips. "I accept my sentence." The kiss that followed was slow, deep, and tasted of a century of waiting. As the sun began to break over the horizon, casting long, golden fingers through the trees, the two of them became a single silhouette against the morning. The hunt was truly over. The predator had found his heart. The prey had found her power. She was the Sun Queen. He was the Lord of Shadows. And together, they were the dawn. As she leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the world wake up in the light they had fought so hard to bring, Alara realized that the Alpha King was no longer hunting her. He had already caught her, and she had never felt more free. This story proves that a true queen and a true mate isn't defined by the dirt on her hands or the cold silence of a scavenger's life. She is defined by the purity of her solar fire and the magnitude of what she is willing to sacrifice to anchor a soul that was once drowning in eternal shadow. Kaelin and the council held the ancient prejudices of the Spire, but Alara possessed the shimmering golden light that burned away their lies and rewritten the very laws of blood. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster of forbidden heat, ancient solar magic, and a love that literally brought the sun back to a dying world, please give this video a massive thumbs up. Your support truly helps this channel grow and lets me know that you crave more powerful, high-stakes romances like the legend of the Sun Queen and her executioner. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I have another heart-wrenching shifter romance coming next week involving a broken, rejected Omega who is exiled to the frozen north, only to be found by a ruthless, ancient billionaire Alpha who hasn't felt a heartbeat in 1,000 years until he smells her. You absolutely do not want to miss it. It's going to be a wild ride from the very first minute. What was your favorite moment in today's epic tale? Was it the breathtaking moment Julian caught the blade of truth with his bare palm to protect Alara, or the legendary scene in the vault where she ignited her own blood to shatter the Aegis and save her king? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I love hearing your theories on the true origin of the Sun blood lineage. Until next time, stay fierce, stay wild, and I'll see you in the next chapter.